talking about a current project of the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory and the Cognition Futures Group. Our working title is Embodied Neurophenomenology. The term neurophenomenology was coined by Francisco Varela to describe a route toward a kind of solution to the mind-body problem / the hard problem of consciousness, or as a route toward bridging the explanatory gap. Whether it can successfully accomplish any of that is beyond the scope of this presentation, but less controversially, in order to make real progress in the scientific study of mind, to quote Varela, we need to turn to a systematic exploration of the only link between mind and consciousness that seems both obvious and natural, the structure of human experience itself. And that means incorporating findings, if you will, from our subjective experiences into the third-personal scientific study of the mind. First-personal methods like introspection or phenomenological reduction and third-personal methods must be in dialogue, imposing upon one another mutually informed constraints. So, for example, what we learn via a contemplative meditative practice can be used to guide experiment design in computational neuroscience, and vice versa. Perhaps the more robust neuroscientific concepts and paradigms can be used to aid the first-personal practice. So that's one example, but what first-personal methodologies exactly have the potential to make contact with third-personal measures? Conversely, what third-personal measures in particular are relevant to subjective experience? We're saying that input from the first-personal is needed to identify the relevant third-personal dynamics and vice versa, and then we enter this dialogue of constraints from one on the other, but where do we begin? One place to start, and where research has begun, is by trying to bring insight from first-personal reports into one of the many established paradigms in neuroscience. For example, connecting subjective reports of altered states of consciousness to certain EEG or fMRI dynamics. In general, the focus has tended to be on the brain, first on the brain or even just parts of it as the relevant location for these phenomena, but also on the brain as an information processing system. This view leads naturally to exploring the computational level as a bridge between the first-personal and the third-personal. For example, Anil Seth's work using connectionist computational models to capture phenomenological properties of vision, and many attempts to use predictive processing to explain aspects of subjectivity. This research area has been referred to as computational phenomenology. But while these approaches may still allow us to bring in the body as an essential component of whatever phenomenon is being examined, a neurophenomenological project doesn't have to start with this view of the brain as a computer. We don't have to start with the brain at all. In contrast, we propose as a starting point a strong embodiment thesis inspired by the work of Thomas Fuchs and the giants of continental phenomenology whose shoulders he stands on. Fuchs writes, at the most foundational layer of affective experience, we find what may be called the feeling of being alive, a pre-reflective, undirected bodily self-awareness that constitutes the unnoticed background of all intentional feeling, perceiving, or acting. Bodily dynamics, at least for animal minds, are the foundation of all further experience and cognition. This strong embodiment thesis can be seen as the first constraint imposed on the scientific study of consciousness by findings from first-personal investigation. Put simply, I do not feel like a brain trapped in a skull, so the third-personal investigation of subjectivity should not start inside the skull. But, you may ask, aren't we doing neurophenomenology? Regarding the term, Varela writes that the neuro, in neurophenomenology, refers to, quote, the entire array of scientific correlates which are relevant in cognitive science, but to speak of a neuropsychoevolutionary phenomenology would be unduly cumbersome. It follows from this strong embodiment thesis that physiology, as the study of the body-wide system dynamics that contribute to the basic background state of mind, falls under this category of neuro. More specifically, physiological dynamics matter here for two reasons. First, our subjective experience extends through our whole body. With some interesting exceptions, our experienced body is coextensive with the physical body. To use the terms of art of continental phenomenology, there is a syncope of the lived body and the living body. Second, the physiological level matters for the dynamics of the brain as an information processing system. The biochemical cellular dynamics of the brain constrain the electromagnetic dynamics. If the electromagnetic level is where information processing takes place, then non-digital factors, if you will, would matter for the way the brain processes information. The cellular level metabolic or energetic dynamics in the brain are the foundation of further information processing, perhaps setting the parameters for cognition in a sense. As such, this strong embodiment thesis has implications for the other neurophenomenological investigations mentioned. So we propose that the physiological level is a proper starting place for third-personal investigation, and on the first-personal side falls interoception, but not the mere unreflective or untrained interoception that we are participating in constantly. One of Varella's main ideas is that the first-personal investigation of mind should be rigorous, can be trained, can be built from ideas in continental phenomenology like those of Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, and ultimately findings should be able to be validated by third-personal measures. So by interoception, we want to refer not merely to the brain's reception of bodily signals or to our unreflective awareness of those signals, but to the practice of taking the phenomenological or reflective stance toward one's sense of embodiment. If interoception is to be used as a proper first-personal methodology, the impact of expectation on the interpretation of interoceptive signals must be bracketed, to use the phenomenological term of art. The impact of top-down prediction and expectation on our perceived bodily states is widely discussed in the philosophy of emotion and when talking about how predictive processing makes sense of embodiment. That top-down impact of expectation can be seen as exactly why first-personal methods need to be trained and refined. One's ability to bracket or suspend predictions while exercising interoceptive capacities must be trained alongside the development of a language to describe interocepted qualities. In other words, we want to gather as pure of data as possible from interoception, attempting to observe something like the basic feeling of being alive, which, quoting Fuchs, marks the transition from the autopoietic, self-producing structure of the organism to the living being's pre-reflective self-awareness as grasped by phenomenology. So, zooming in on the brain is not a necessary first step. We can start from the level of the whole organism, and there, we argue, we can find structural similarities between the right physiological dynamics and dynamics of phenomenology. Continuing with insights from Fuchs, two high-level examples of such structural similarities are vitality and conation. From the first personal perspective, one's feeling of vitality, or lack thereof, can be described as diffuse ease or unease, relaxation or tension, restriction or expansion, freshness and vigor, or tiredness and exhaustion. This is captured by much of the way we talk about mood. Here, we can appeal to work in the phenomenology of affectivity for a taxonomy of some of these feelings. The third personal dynamics with which this affective state corresponds are the, quote, homeodynamic regulatory processes that take place between the body and the brain on many levels, which involve hormone concentrations, blood glucose levels, oxygen and carbon dioxide, etc. Here, further investigation into the dynamics of particular physiological systems will aid the description of these regulatory processes. A second structural similarity, or isomorphism perhaps, between first and third personal dynamics is conation, or drive, or being after something. Fuchs cites as the third personal correspondence to conation the dialectical relationship between the living being and its environment. Basically, we need to interact with the environment and take things from it and give things to it in order to persist as a living organism. There's much more to say here, and there's obviously an interesting relationship between conation and vitality, but for now, I'll call this study of conation Embodied Neurophenomenology and move on. We want to explore how a neurophenomenological program can illuminate the details on both the first personal and the third personal side of vitality and the interoceptible dynamics associated with it. Which physiological measures exactly can illuminate the phenomenological dynamics of vitality? It's certainly more complicated than mere concentrations of single chemicals at a particular time point, and first-personal insight can be used to help identify the relevant level of biological or physiological description. So, we'd like to initiate this process of mutually informed constraint between these domains. Here are some candidates. Still pretty high level and explored by Fuchs, Damasio, and others is the relationship between homeostatic feelings like thirst, hunger, general discomfort, and the non-equilibrium status of the self-sustaining physical systems at play. Going a little deeper, bodies can adapt, so when one fasts, for example, the subjective feeling of hunger or discomfort may eventually be replaced by a comfortable, seemingly equilibrium state. And how exactly one reacts to such a change depends on the history of the systems at play. Investigating the physiological and phenomenological dynamics associated with different timescales could be fruitful. Here we list some other candidate phenomena. The key idea here is that to fill in these gaps, insight is needed from both first-personal and third-personal exploration and from a dialogue between the two. What cannot be forgotten in this dialogical process is that while engaging in interoception or any other phenomenological method, the subject is both a part of and an observer of the system. This opens up the possibility of the subject exercising conscious control as well as unconscious impact over the phenomena being observed while observing it. This process is realized in the case of neurofeedback, and perhaps more relevantly here, biofeedback. In the physiological context, we can raise and lower our heart rates. We can use breathing exercises to change certain qualities of our experiences. We can modulate our psychological response to stress, and thus perhaps modulate the release of stress hormones. In embodied mindfulness practices, we can bring energy into particular parts of the body. There's an extent to which we have control, mind over matter, and that is an important factor when talking about the observation of bodily and mental dynamics. Lastly, how could findings from this embodied neurophenomenological program be utilized? First, regarding the development of artificial intelligence, if certain structural properties of the physical system allow or correspond to or coextend with structural properties of cognition, then there may be no clean cut between hardware and software. Figuring out which dynamics the hardware must embody may aid the development of artificially intelligent systems. Perhaps the hardware of true AI must be, in some sense, living. More importantly, regarding human health and well-being, findings from the neurophenomenological program described here would improve our understanding of the mind-body, thought-feeling relationships, and thus improve treatment of mental health issues. Instead of zooming in on the brain and some specific activity of some particular chemical substance, perhaps a more general, simpler, less disrupting physiological intervention could move a patient's mood in the right direction. We already know that diet and exercise level interventions can have a dramatic effect on mental well-being, but knowledge of the details of some of these mind-body relationships would allow refinement of this kind of intervention. With that, thank you for your attention, and feel free to contact myself or the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab if you'd like to learn more about the project.